At the height of its power, Ant Group wasn't just another Chinese tech company. It was a financial juggernaut poised to disrupt the global banking system. Backed by Alibaba and led by the charismatic Jack Ma, Ant promised a future without traditional banks, where billions of people could access loans, insurance, and investment tools at their fingertips. Its technology was fast, its reach massive, and its ambition limitless. In late 2000, Ant was preparing for the largest IPO in human history, valued at over $34 billion, and set to eclipse the likes of Saudi Aramco. Investors from New York to Tokyo were salivating. This was the golden ticket. But then, almost overnight, everything collapsed. Just days before the historic listing, Beijing pulled the plug. No explanation, no negotiation, just silence and a disappearing Jack Ma. What happened? How did the Chinese government go from backing Ant to crushing it? Was this about financial risk? Or was it something far more political? As the dust settled, a terrifying picture emerged. One of power struggles, state control, and a warning to every tech giant in China. This is the true story behind the fall of Ant Group. A story of ambition, censorship, and the cost of challenging the system. And it all unraveled faster than anyone could have imagined. Long before it became the poster child for China's tech crackdown, Ant Group was a symbol of innovation born not out of a bank, but from a shopping cart. In 2004, Alibaba was expanding fast, but Chinese consumers still didn't trust online transactions. Enter Alipay. What began as a simple escrow service to hold funds between buyers and sellers quickly morphed into something far bigger, a digital wallet that would change the way 1.4 billion people handled money. By the 2010s, Alipay had transformed into a financial ecosystem under Ant Financial, later rebranded as Ant Group. It wasn't just about payments anymore. Ant offered microloans, wealth management, insurance, credit scoring, and even facial recognition-powered transfers. Through apps like Huabei and Jigbase, users could borrow money in seconds. MyBank, its online-only bank, used artificial intelligence to assess risk instead of outdated credit reports, and thanks to its deep integration into daily life, Ant collected massive amounts of behavioral data that allowed it to lend smarter and faster than any traditional bank ever could. Its scale was staggering. At one point, Alipay processed more transactions than Visa and MasterCard combined. Over 700 million people used Ant's services monthly, and more than 100 million small businesses relied on it. What made Ant even more disruptive was that it operated largely outside of China's traditional financial regulatory system. It wasn't a bank, so it didn't have to follow banking rules. It wasn't a traditional investment firm, so it bypassed capital requirements. It was a hybrid, untouchable, uncontainable, and unlike anything regulators had ever faced. Investors, meanwhile, were hypnotized. Ant's business model promised low overhead, massive user data, and lightning-fast growth. The company expanded its services to India, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Africa. With each market entry, it collected more user data, fine-tuned its algorithms, and tightened its grip on the digital economy. And then came the masterstroke, an IPO that would shatter global records. Backed by Jack Ma's charisma and Alibaba's global clout, Ant announced its dual listing in Shanghai and Hong Kong. The world took notice. It wasn't just the numbers, though. A $34 billion IPO was hard to ignore. It was what the company represented: the future of finance, unshackled by old institutions. Ant had promised to democratize credit, empower small businesses, and bring China's vast population into the digital financial age. It was sleek, smart, and global. But behind the curtain, the Chinese Communist Party was watching and growing increasingly uneasy. Ant wasn't just a company anymore. It was becoming too powerful, too influential, and perhaps most dangerously, too independent. And at the center of it all was Jack Ma, a man whose rising profile would soon collide head-on with the very forces that had once nurtured his success. The world was holding its breath. On November 5, 2020, Ant Group was set to go public in Shanghai and Hong Kong in what would become the largest IPO in global history. The company was poised to raise over $34 billion, giving it a valuation north of $300 billion more than most major banks. Investors had poured in from every corner of the globe. In just a few days, Ant would surpass not only every fintech rival, but would also outshine Alibaba's own historic IPO. But just 3 days before the grand event, the unthinkable happened. The IPO was abruptly halted by Chinese regulators. Markets were stunned. The Shanghai Stock Exchange released a vague statement about significant issues that may cause Ant Group not to meet listing conditions. The Hong Kong listing was cancelled in lockstep. Billions of dollars evaporated in hours. What could have gone so wrong so fast? The answer lay in a speech, an unusually bold one, delivered by Jack Ma just days earlier at a financial summit in Shanghai. Speaking before an audience that included senior officials from China's banking system, Ma criticized the country's financial regulators, accusing them of being stuck in outdated models that stifled innovation. He likened Chinese banks to pawn shops, implying that they demanded excessive collateral instead of embracing risk and technology. That speech was the match that lit the fuse. By publicly challenging the very institutions that controlled China's financial order, Ma had crossed a line, one that tech CEOs in China were never supposed to cross. He had embarrassed high-ranking officials in front of the world. He hadn't just provoked regulators, he'd humiliated them. Almost immediately after his speech, China's central bank, the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission, and the China Securities Regulatory Commission launched emergency meetings. Within hours, the narrative around Ant Group began to shift. What was once celebrated as a triumph of Chinese innovation was now recast as a systemic threat. Regulators claimed that Ant's lending practices were too risky, that it had too much user data, and that its complex structure made it impossible to monitor effectively. Behind the scenes, however many insiders believed the real issue was political. Ma had grown too big too fast. His vision of a borderless, bankless financial future, operating in parallel with the Communist Party's tightly controlled system, was not just ambitious. It was dangerous. Chinese authorities feared that Ant's scale could destabilize the economy if anything went wrong. But perhaps more importantly, they feared Jack Ma himself. Charismatic, international, and increasingly outspoken, he was beginning to represent a version of China that was harder to control a billionaire who didn't follow the script. In the days following the IPO cancellation, Ant was summoned to face regulators. Officials grilled executives about the company's lending practices, data usage, and risk models. And then Jack Ma disappeared. For nearly 3 months, the most famous businessman in China vanished from public view. Rumors swirled from government detention to self-imposed exile, but no explanation came. His absence was deafening. The message was clear: no one, no matter how rich or powerful, was above the party. Ant Group's dream of a historic IPO was not just postponed, it was obliterated. But this was only the beginning. What followed wasn't just regulatory scrutiny. It was a full-blown takedown, the likes of which modern China's corporate world had never seen. The state had turned its eye toward Ant, and it wasn't looking away. The disappearance of Jack Ma marked a turning point not only for Ant Group, but for the entire Chinese tech sector. In early 2021, The warm facade between Beijing and its once celebrated tech titans cracked open to reveal a far colder reality when power challenges control always wins. Almost immediately after the IPO's cancellation, Ant Group was ordered to undergo a sweeping rectification process. This wasn't just a few regulatory tweaks, it was a fundamental dismantling of its business model. The company was instructed to restructure itself as a financial holding company, bringing it under the same strict rules that govern banks. That meant higher capital requirements, stricter oversight, and a complete separation of its payment platform from its credit insurance and wealth management arms. What had once been a nimble, tech-driven empire was now being forcibly molded into a traditional financial institution, slower, smaller, and far more regulated. But the regulators weren't finished. Ant's most lucrative businesses, Huabei and Jiebei, which offered consumer microloans, were hit especially hard. These platforms had helped Ant issue loans worth hundreds of billions of dollars without putting much of its own capital at risk. Instead, the company relied on partner banks to shoulder the bulk of the lending. This model had supercharged Ant's profitability, but Beijing saw it as dangerous financial engineering. Authorities demanded that Ant fund a far greater share of these loans from its own balance sheet, drastically limiting its growth and increasing its exposure to risk. The core of Ant's innovation was now under direct threat. At the same time, China's top antitrust watchdog opened an investigation into Alibaba for monopolistic behavior, further tightening the noose. Jack Ma's other ventures were now under scrutiny too, from cloud computing to logistics. The unspoken message. No part of his empire was untouchable. Behind closed doors, regulators and state-owned banks moved to reshape the financial ecosystem that Ant had disrupted. New rules were introduced to limit how much personal data fintech firms could collect and use. Algorithms used to assess consumer credit were ordered to be transparent and supervised. Credit scoring companies had to apply for licenses and share their data with the government. In short, the very ingredients that had made Ant so dominant. Its speed, its data, its innovation were now being weaponized against it. Meanwhile, Jack Ma reappeared, but not as the bold visionary who once commanded global stages. His comeback was muted, cautious, and controlled. He spoke in pre-recorded videos, made quiet visits to schools and agricultural projects, and kept his head down. The man who once said, "We should let the market decide," was now visibly humbled. Even Ant's corporate messaging changed. The company pivoted to emphasize its alignment with government priorities, pledging to support rural development and small businesses under Beijing's vision for common prosperity. It began spinning off parts of its operations and giving regulators deeper access to its systems. It became, in effect, a company apologizing for its own success. The transformation of Ant Group was not just about curbing financial risk. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign to reassert state control over private enterprise. Ant had dared to imagine a future where fintech could operate independently of banks and government institutions. Beijing responded by bringing it to heel. And while Ant survived, it did so as a shell of its former self. Crippled, divided, and no longer a threat to the system that destroyed it. The fallout from Ant Group's collapse was far-reaching and brutal. It wasn't just the company that paid the price. Millions of investors, entire industries, and even China's reputation in global markets took a hit. In the immediate aftermath of the IPO suspension, retail investors, especially those in Hong Kong, were devastated. Many had poured their savings into what they believed was a sure thing. The demand for Ant shares had been so overwhelming that brokers had offered record levels of margin financing. Some investors had even borrowed money to secure allocations. When the deal collapsed, so did their dreams of easy wealth. But the consequences extended far beyond financial losses. confidence in Chinese tech companies was shattered. For years, firms like Alibaba, Tencent, and Ant Group had been the crown jewels of China's global image symbols of its innovation and rising power. Now, foreign investors began to question whether any Chinese company could truly operate independently of the government's will. Was any business safe from arbitrary intervention? The regulatory storm that started with Ant quickly spread across the entire tech sector. Beijing launched a full-scale crackdown on everything from e-commerce and ride-hailing to online education and video gaming. Billion-dollar valuations were slashed overnight. New IPOs were delayed or scrapped. Some companies were forced to delist from foreign exchanges altogether. The message was clear: profits and power would no longer be allowed to grow faster than political loyalty. For Ant, the long-term impact was even more painful. Once valued at over $300 billion, the company saw its valuation drop by more than half. Its fintech empire was fractured, its influence diminished, and its growth stunted. Strategic partnerships were paused, expansion plans were shelved, and talent began to flee. Internally, morale plummeted as teams scrambled to meet new regulatory requirements and restructure their operations. Globally, Ant's ambitions were quietly walked back. The company had once planned to export its financial technology across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Now those plans were stuck in limbo. Foreign regulators viewed Ant with suspicion, wary of the Chinese government's influence and the potential misuse of data. And within China, smaller fintech startups, once eager to emulate Ant's model, now reconsidered. The playbook that had once made Ant a giant was now seen as a cautionary tale. The chilling effect was real. Entrepreneurs began to self-censor, scaling back their ambitions or pivoting into safer, less politically sensitive industries. Capital began flowing into state-approved sectors, semiconductors, green energy, and infrastructure, while consumer tech lost its luster. Ant Group had become a symbol not of disruption, but of deterrence. And yet, the silence from within the company was deafening. There were no public complaints, no lawsuits, no protests. In China's tightly controlled environment, there was simply acceptance. Ant's leadership towed the line, parroted state messaging, and tried to move forward in a landscape they no longer controlled. The rise of Ant had once embodied China's entrepreneurial spirit. Its fall served as a warning that spirit had boundaries, and crossing them would come at a cost few could afford. Today, Ant Group still exists, but it's a very different creature than the one that nearly took over the world's financial imagination. Its growth has slowed, its ambitions scaled down, and its influence tightly monitored. For all the regulatory language about risk prevention and financial stability, the real reason behind Ant's downfall remains a subject of global debate. Was Ant truly a threat to China's financial system? Or was it simply a threat to the balance of power that the Communist Party was determined to preserve? Some analysts argue that Beijing's concerns were not entirely unfounded. Ant had built a sprawling financial infrastructure that touched nearly every corner of Chinese life without being subject to the capital controls, transparency, or reserve requirements imposed on traditional banks. If something had gone wrong, if its algorithms failed, if credit defaults soared, or if a liquidity crisis struck, millions could have been affected before regulators even realized it. The systemic risk was real, and in a country as large and complex as China, the ripple effects could have been catastrophic. But that's only one side of the story. Others point to a more uncomfortable truth that the crackdown on Ant was as much about politics as it was about finance. Jack Ma had become a celebrity, a global ambassador for China's new tech power. But in the eyes of party leadership, he had crossed an invisible line. His speech in Shanghai wasn't just criticism, it was defiance. And in China, defiance from someone with power, capital, and global influence is intolerable. Ma's version of capitalism, with its embrace of innovation speed and market forces, clashed directly with the party's model of controlled growth, ideological loyalty, and centralized command. In a way, Ant Group's downfall was inevitable. Its very success had made it dangerous. It had exposed the cracks in China's financial regulatory system, shown how quickly power could shift from state banks to tech platforms, and reminded Beijing that control over money was ultimately control over society. In a one-party system that's not negotiable, the aftermath has created a ripple effect across the tech world. Entrepreneurs in China now operate under a new doctrine: stay quiet, stay small, and don't overshadow the state. Innovation is still encouraged, but only within bounds set by the government. And international investors have grown warier. Many now view Chinese companies not just through the lens of profits and market share, but through the unpredictable filter of political risk. Ant's collapse has become a case study in how quickly fortunes can change when politics enter the boardroom. Ironically, the company that once promised to revolutionize finance has now become a cautionary tale about what happens when disruption threatens authority. And Jack Ma, once the symbol of China's tech optimism, remains mostly silent. His image faded from public life, a reminder that even the most successful can vanish in an instant. In recent years, Ant has tried to rebuild. It has complied with regulators, scaled back its ambitions, and publicly aligned itself with national goals like rural revitalization and small business support. But it's no longer leading the charge into the financial future, it's following the script. And while it may one day return to prominence, it will do so only with the party's blessing. The lesson is clear: in China, innovation can take you far, but not beyond the reach of the system that allowed it to flourish in the first place. The story of Ant Group is not just about a company that flew too close to the sun. It's a mirror held up to the world, reflecting the fragile balance between innovation and control. In a different country, Ant's meteoric rise might have been celebrated as a triumph of capitalism. But in China, where the lines between business and politics blur into a single ideology, ambition must always bow to authority. What began as a fintech revolution ended in a silent surrender. The IPO that promised to reshape global finance became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across Asia. Investors learned that profits can vanish overnight. Entrepreneurs learned that visibility invites vulnerability. And governments everywhere took note. Even the biggest tech empires can be dismantled piece by piece if they forget who really holds the power. Ant Group didn't fail because its business was flawed. It failed because it disrupted more than an industry. It disrupted the narrative, and in a system built on control that was the gravest sin of all. So the next time a company promises to change the world, ask this: who gets to decide what the world should look like? Ant dared to dream, but in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and in a way that made the most powerful people in China deeply uncomfortable. And for that, it was brought to its knees not by market forces, but by something far more absolute. Not bankruptcy, not scandal, but silence.